quiet. Kia ora koutou, hara mai and welcome. Ko Angela tuku ingoa, kai toku tuku tuku ohanga at Te Uru District Council. My name is Angela Rule, I'm an Economic Development Advisor at Te Uru District Council, and I project manage this project. Thank you for attending our workshop. We're presenting the findings of an exploration into tree species suitable for the Te Uru District in respect to the right tree in the right place. This work's been funded by the Ministry for Primary Industries, Te Uru Rakau. The key consultant on this project is Lochie MacGillivray of AgFirst Pastoral, who has collated a huge amount of work from a range of contributors. And those contributors are Powrie and Kahungunu for Rangitāne or Tamaki Nui-ā-Rua, James Kendrick from Ngāti Kahungunu to Tamaki Nui-ā-Rua, James of RedAxeNZ Intelligence, Simon Taylor of Fresh Perspective Insight, the team from Scion, Dr. Heather Collins and Andrew McFettridge, and we also thank Hawke's Regional Council, Horizons Regional Council and Regeneration and others for their support. So the aim of this work was to provide a resource for Te Uru landowners considering tree planting that outlines the commercial and geographical viability of a mix of 10 mostly indigenous tree species, 5 of which we would investigate in depth. So the investigation went into climate change impacts in the Te Uru district, community views on afforestation and the social fabric in the district, the landowner context, regulatory and market drivers for the pastoral sector, spatial modelling, wood supply and processing opportunities, workforce implications, and there were 3 on-farm case studies conducted. So the full report will be, you can find on our website this afternoon. We're tidying up some of the appendices, delivering benefits from other organisations, and some geodes maps will be available in time as well. So it takes a bit of IT expertise, which is not my field. So I will hand over to Lochie to tell you about it.
Thanks, Angela, and thanks everybody for coming at a busy time of year. I appreciate that the farmers of you are here. You know, you've got a whole myriad of other things you want to be doing on the farm. Moving up towards Christmas, whether it be shearing or weaning or whatever. So I really appreciate you taking time out to come here. As Angela said, this was quite a substantial bit of work. I think well over a few hundred pages. I've forgotten how many thousand words, probably over 120,000 words. So it was, as Angela said, a collaboration of quite a few people. I don't claim to be an expert in any one of those fields. I was just project managing and bringing it together. And as Angela said, and I apologise, when you do these PowerPoints and you've got a screen a couple of inches away from you, it's easy to read it. And in different light conditions, it gets a bit tricky. So I'll probably just read through what some of the key points of all of these are. So my apologies that you can't read it all. So basically the work followed on some work that the Te Uru District Council asked to be done in terms of understanding land resource use, and the initial project was focused around what some horticultural potential could be in the district. They recognised that there's quite a substantial land use change happening in the hill country. They wanted to investigate that, and with view of putting the right tree in the right place rather than wholesale forestation going on. And they're really looking to fill in the information gap so that they can supply that information back out to the stakeholders. So what we've endeavoured to do is try and fill some of those holes. As Angela said, there was a fairly extensive team, and I'll work through that as we work through. The project was split into 3 major milestones. As Angela said, again, the first was to identify 10 tree species, and then narrow that down into 5 species that it's worthwhile doing further analysis on. The next milestone was a really in-depth analysis of those 5 species, looking at spatially where they'd grow, where they'd be suitable, what the community aspirations and considerations would be. We did a number of case studies of individual farms, and we're fortunate enough to have one of those farmers in the room today, and some pretty interesting results, I feel. We looked at some downstream processing opportunities, and as I said to the councillors a month or so ago, you know, Dannyburg and Woodville were forestry towns way back. And so some of these value-add processing abilities is possibly inherent in some of the DNA that exists in the area. And what does that mean in terms of workforce and job creation? And then, of course, there's a final report summary, which I think has been distributed already to many. So, part one, report summaries, community feedback. We'd had 2 or 3 workshops with various community groups. And so this is a summary of 3 days, or 3.5 days discussion in terms of what came out of it. And clearly there's a lot more than just 5 bullet points. But this was common all the way through. So we need to be very aware of the environment and cultural imperatives across the region. There was absolute consensus we need to be looking after our soil, our biodiversity, our fresh water. And you know, from my feeling, and Tony Rhodes sitting here would know that that's foremost for many farmers as well. It's not new. There was a general belief that wholesale afforestation is not the answer that we want for this district. And they also thought that there's a shared responsibility in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and to load that just onto one sector is not necessarily fair. And they believe that there's opportunities to promote some of the good work that's actually happening in our rural communities, and sort of get our urban counterparts understanding and involved in what's going on. So, morning Malcolm. The scene reiterated. So we started this project just as COVID was hitting us, so that's 2020. And this was some information that Malcolm and the team provided me in terms of what had happened the previous year. So in 2019, 85% of the land area traded went into forestry. There was 20,000 stock units lost, and an estimate of $2 million worth of community spend happening in the local towns. And that was at a carbon price of less than $25 a tonne. Currently, the carbon price in that last sale, which was a week ago, I suppose, $68 a tonne. And the pricing that we used and all the modelling work that we did was $35 a tonne. At the time, we had a big debate about where we should put it. There was an argument to have it at $27 and $30, and we thought we'd stretch it out to $35 to cover ourselves. That's the carbon price history that we're seeing. And so when we put it at $35 a tonne for the scenario work, you know, we were justified in doing that, we thought at the time, but look what's happened since. So again, if we look at the historical price, you can see how carbon has you know, rapidly increased. And what's one of the conclusions I make is that we've been continually underestimating the escalation in carbon price. And on the right-hand side of that red line is Jardin's contract price for carbon going forward, and you know, the growth there is substantially less than what we've seen previously. I have no idea, in all honesty, where it's going to end up and what it's going to be. You guys have probably a better feel for that than anybody else. It's just speculation really at the moment, what's going to happen with carbon price. We looked at climate change as well and what's going to happen in the area. There's some positives and negatives. In terms of positives, you know, there's going to be a greater range of crops and tree species that we might be able to grow in this district. The impact on forestry, we're probably going to expect better growth rates. Already they're quite good growth rates, but maybe, you know, they'll be along the lines that we might be getting out of the Wairoa Gisborne area in terms of carbon accumulation. But of course there's some big negatives as well, and you know, there's a high demand for water, an increase in storms, wind damage, higher risk of fire. It means that there's a higher risk of forestry establishment in those initial years, and of course high risk in harvesting in those 2 or 3 years that are very vulnerable post-harvest. And a more variable pasture production. So climate impacts are possibly going to be greater for pastoral farming than for afforestation. It's a bold call I make, I know, but the graph on the left there is a Southern Hawke's Bay property that we've been measuring pasture growth for the last 20 years. And you can see an average decline in pasture production over these last 20 years. The graph on the right-hand side says, or tries to illustrate, the shift in pasture production, the seasonal shift that we're seeing. So that green line at the top there, if you can see that, is the first 10 years of recording pasture on this property. And the orange line at the bottom is the last 8 years, to be precise. And you can see the change in, so we're getting similar winter production, similar spring production, but that autumn production is becoming very vulnerable. It oscillates as well, so we get fantastic springs, but we get some real doozies as well. The Te Uru district area is, as you know, I'm not telling you suck eggs, is a high erosion vulnerable area. We've got Grant Cooper in the mix here. He knows more about that than anybody probably. And this map probably came from his team somewhere. Anything over 1,000 tonnes of sediment per square kilometre, which is that red area, is highly vulnerable land. And we need to do something about that. It probably can't stay in its current use if it's in pastoral use because of its vulnerability. The blue areas, 700 to 1,000, I mean, you can do a lot with poplar pole planting in that area, so it doesn't necessarily have to go into afforestation for stability. And, the 500 to 750, Grant might want to talk about this later. It's vulnerable, we need to be careful with it, but, there's best business practice, we'll be able to maintain that soil.
Lochie, are you able to overlay on that map what works are already done? Already in forestry?
Yeah, we can, but I haven't got that in my PowerPoint demonstration at this stage, sorry.
Because like 70% of those farmers in those areas have already undertaken work.
Yes, correct. My point is that we've got a vulnerable landscape in the area and that we've got to carry on doing what we've been doing and trying to improve our freshwater quality that comes out of it. And which is a segue into this next slide, really. New Zealand has one of the higher rates of erosion in the world because of our young soil type, our rainfall, and unfortunately our agricultural practices. And pastoral systems typically have higher water flow and yields, higher water nutrient levels, they have high sediment levels, higher fecal chloroform levels, and higher water temperatures. So that's not to say all pastoral systems have that, but typically that's what we're seeing. And when we compare that with a typical forestry situation, with forestry we get an increase in carbon reserves. I know there's a debate about carbon sequestration and pasture, but I'll just park that for maybe later. It does help reduce erosion and sedimentation. Of course, there's an argument about its biodiversity, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And it does enhance water quality, and in the right place it can be profitable. So these are sort of the 10 tree species. I won't go into the detail there, but the ones that are covered are the ones that come to the top of your mind. So, the cypresses, the eucalypts. We looked at 2 tree species of natives that have a commercial potential, Kauri and Totora, Manuka, silvopastoral things, radiata, coastal redwood, Douglas fir, a mixed species. Okay, so I'm pausing for a bit of a breath. What I'm wanting to do, and I should have said earlier on, is I'd like to just to work through the technical parts of the report first. Happy to answer any questions for clarification, but there's a lot to get through, and if we start debating some of the earlier assumptions or whatever, we probably won't get to the end. So unless you've got a burning question or want some clarification on something like just been asked before, I wonder if we can skip on through. So the Scion Report was probably the heavy lifting part of the whole project, so they led a team of geospatial experts who did some quite intensive mapping in the district. They're doing this across the country, so they did some light work for the Hawke's Bay Regional Council. They're probably doing some work for Horizons Grant, I'm not too certain. I presume they possibly are. And so they've got a number of models which they're working with at the moment. So the first of that is Treescape. And so what Treescape does is looks at a whole lot of characteristics and identifies where trees should be and where they could grow, and then sort of flows on from there, looking at what tree would be suitable on that site given the environment around it. So that environment's wind, depth of soil, slope, rainfall, all those sorts of things. Then they did a spatial sort of economic assessment for all those tree species across the region, taking into account distance from market, growth rates, cost of harvest, cost of transport, all those sorts of things, and did that geospatially. And then they've looked at wood processing opportunities as well. So really the heavy lifting part of the work. Angela mentioned that the geospatial work will be available for you to have a look at and utilise, and that was one of the key outcomes we wanted out of this report, so that for a particular land holding or your farm, you could zero down and see what species would work or what would grow there and what some of the economics from that would be. So there's a bit of work to do there because we've got to get that in a system or in a manner that's easy to use. At this stage, the Treescape and that spatial modelling work is more of an academic process, and we've got to get that loaded into the into the web pages so it's easily available. So I'll skip through that slide. I've covered a bit of it really. What happened then? Okay, so a bit of technical stuff. So it takes in a whole lot of attributes, slope, aspect, sediment type, and puts an algorithm around that for each geospatial area. And I think it's just, I've forgotten how many square metres was the resolution. It's a quite high resolution. And again, I just threw this up here because that was in part of the report. So for each geospatial site, where was the predominant wind coming from, et cetera, and what are the risks that they see going forward. So it's quite heavy going and quite detailed in terms of its output. Eventually, what it did is it characterised each parcel of land into 9 categories, and you could correlate that to land use capacities in our traditional thinking, but a little bit more precise and not necessarily overlapped traditional LUCs. So that is kind of the fuzzy membership, as it's called, the fuzzy membership groupings for Te Uru. And then if you can see that box on the sort of southeast coast there, if we zoom into there, that's sort of the resolution that we've got for an individual farm. And so using that layer and what would work there in terms of tree growth, they can then overlay the various species that might grow in those areas. Yes, side. Okay, so that's what we're moving into this next one. And so this was looking at each potential of the 5 tree species about where they might grow. This one here is, if I had it working on my laptop, I'll be able to tell you, this is radiata. And so the darker green is more suitable, so the darker blue is more suitable, and sort of the browny to light green is not very suitable for growing the species. And because I might have to scoot through. Yeah. Wait till we get there. Got a plan for the dairy country. For the life of me, I just can't recall. So I have a bit of dementia kicking in here. Those 4 boxes on the below that graph were for various assumptions that we made. That's it. Well done, Melvin. At least somebody was paying attention in class. You should be sitting at the front. Yeah, it's absolutely right. There was wind, there was terrain, there was rainfall. Absolutely. Yep.
Why is the eco-hangar area not suitable?
Sorry?
Why would the eco-hangar area not be suitable, down to the south?
That's more for Te Uru.
Yeah. Might have been wind, yeah. Could have been wind. Yeah. To be honest, we asked the experts all these questions and they gave us good answers, but I've forgotten. Sorry, I've forgotten some things, you know.
No, is it because you know like with climate change? Is this with the climate that we have now?
Yes, it is.
Good climate.
It is. It's kind of hard to predict what climate change is going to deliver, and that adds a whole quantum more work that, you know, you can go down various rabbit holes in it. So,
Yeah, no, because we're westerly exposed, but we're expecting more easterly as climate changes. So.
maybe. This one here is coastal redwood, which, you know, is a very popular tree from many farmers thinking. Very long cycle, but when we look at that in terms of site suitability, you've got that strip along the coast there where it's not suitable. Obviously there's, you know, some high altitude areas, and down there towards Ekatuna, I think that's actually quite rugged territory, is probably why it's not suitable for pines and or redwoods.
So what, the darker is more suitable? The darker?
The blue is more suitable, and so if you can just see on the right there, Tony, you've got the shades of the blue decreasing to the sort of the orange in terms of site suitability. And so that's actually about production. So it's about growth rates. Yeah, possibly. That's Lusitanica. So Lusitanicas, you know, our macrocarpus, our cypresses, not very suitable for most of the district.
Why was that?
Why was that?
Candy or what?
No, wind, I think was a key thing. Soils was fine, slope was fine, but it must have been wind. In the report, it is detailed as to what those are, sorry, but if I just had too much information to load into. It's in that report there, yeah.
I think one of the key points like this
Yeah, go for it.
is it's not so much that the tree wouldn't grow, it's that it wouldn't grow back well compared to
Absolutely, yeah. And again,
from a production point of view.
yeah.
Just tree a little bit.
Yeah, and again with eucalypts, you know, I mean, there's some areas, but when you compare that with eucalypts going back to pine trees, you know, it doesn't really compare that well.
Does that take into account the marketing of it at all?
No, this was just straight production. This wasn't an economic thing at that stage.
Right.
Okay, so this was just growth. And Totara, quite good in some areas. And Manuka, again.
That's the dairy company.
Yep. But that's, you know, as you say, this hasn't got economic considerations in there. And that's the next bit that we did, looking at the economic assessment for all the various layers. And, you know, so this work, from the help of P.F. Olsen, you know, talks about the matrix of economics. And so, you know, you've got distance to market having a significant impact, but also the scale of the forestation that you're doing and the roading that's required to get in there. And on top of the market itself and site-specific harvesting issues. If we just, Lawrence, I can give you a copy of this, so don't bother about trying to take pictures. If we just look at economics for pines, and the map on the left is suitability for processing at the local mills. You can see that the green is economic and quite suitable, and the brown becomes a cost in getting it to the market. This is without carbon. This is just the straight wood returns. If you're looking at export, then you look at the right-hand side and the distance from the ports of Napier and or Wellington. You know, some of that sort of area in the southeastern corner starts to get difficult at current prices in terms of profitability for harvest. So if we look at it a little bit more in a complex situation, that top row of three graphs is the economics of pine trees, at a discount factor of 3%. And the middle one there is the current price. The one on the left is 18% off current price, and the one on the right is 18% above current price. Why 18%? I think that was just the standard deviation that they were using across the range of prices that they had. Okay, so the take-home message out of that, if you look at the top line, middle graph, for most of this region, on just a straight commercial harvest situation, most of the Te Uru District Council area is suitable or profitable for growing pines. If there's an increase in the log price, which is quite potentially possible, then look at that right-hand side on the top line, and again, the shade, the colour of the shade is return NPV value per hectare in terms of return. The bottom three graphs is when we use a discount rate of 6%. And so what are you going to use, 3% or 6%? At the moment, most of us economists are using around about a 3% discount rate. But, you know, if you asked me 10 or 15 years ago, I would have said that's way too low, you should be using 6%. So, you know, Malcolm might have a comment on that. But so that just says talks about the, you know, looking forward. Now, if you used 6% and you had an 18% price disadvantage from where we are at the moment, a lot of that area in the sort of the southeast corner of Te Uru is uneconomic for forestry. Now, a lot of detail. I'm just showing you this because in the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about what happens when you overlay carbon onto that. That's $35 a tonne. And it's that. Okay, so at same scenarios, basically, we just added in carbon at $35 a tonne, and so even at a low carbon price, at a low forest price, it's economic to grow pines through most of the area at a 6% discount rate or a 3% discount rate, and you can't see that, but the legend on the extreme right-hand side is the NPV value, net present value per hectare, what it is per hectare. I thought...
What is the pale blue value in terms of NPV? On the bottom.
Yeah, it's around, I can't read that either, Tony, but from memory it's around about $16,000 a hectare. Unfortunately, and I'll get to it later, that's at $35 a tonne. Currently, it's around about $30,000 a hectare at our current pricing.
Is that milling as well as carbon, or just carbon?
That's milling as well as carbon, so that's the whole shooting box. But that's under a harvest scheme allocation, not as a permanent forest one, which is more profitable. But we'll get to that later. So this is a bit of a summary of where we got to in terms of NPVs and return on investment with carbon and without carbon. So radiata pine without carbon, a 9% return on investment. And when we added in the carbon, 31% return on investment. And you compare that with the other tree species, redwood 11%, poplar poles 31%. Yeah, you go poplar poles. Because you can graze them underneath them. Native regeneration, 1.5%. I think that's pretty optimistic, actually. I need to go back and do those figures because in some current work I was doing, I was coming out at negative for native regeneration. Depends on the... Beg your pardon?
Is that because of that establishment?
Yeah.
So if you've already got some scattered manuka from 1990, you can't claim credits on that anyway.
Correct.
So when you underplant, that would be why you get...
Yeah, look, and you guys might have a better feel, but I can't recall what price we use for native establishment here, but in some work I'm doing in Hawke's Bay, it's $11,500 a hectare for establishment in natives. So it's pretty pricey. Because, you know, there's more work that has to be done, there's follow-on work, etc. Manuka with 30% of the honey going in a JV, disappointing at 12.8%. This is without land being brought into it, the value of the land. Pines and leaf at $35 a tonne. I'll come back to that later on. It's over 31% in that analysis, but there's actually a sweet spot, which we'll talk about later. Yeah, but not when you compare it with pines.
No, that's what it means. It's only when you compare it with pines, but in almost every other industry in the world.
Oh,
it'd be
yeah,
like, go for it.
yeah.
And you can still graze underneath it, potentially. No.
Potentially, but then you have a decrease. Yeah.
You only need to
Wood supply and processing opportunities. Sorry, this graph is a little bit hard for you to read, but it's really about the volume of wood supply coming in or coming out of the district. So there's a big lump coming through in the next few years, quite a massive trough, and then a bit of a lift that's going out 30 years, I think. That's for radiata. For other species, it's pretty awkward at the moment, and that's part of the problem because there's a low supply of alternative species, which it's this chicken and egg situation, you know. So we need 225,000 per annum of extra log coming in between 2035 and 2045. So one might think that that's what we're getting out of this afforestation that's going on. But a lot of this afforestation is going on are putting it into permanent trees. And so we're not necessarily going to get the benefit of that unless we do something about it proactively. Wood processors, there's one in Dannyvert, Kiwi Lumber. I think there's one on the Wairarapa as well. And there's a little bit in there in the report about their capacity, who they are, where they are. I'm skipping through. What got me in the report is some of the new options we can consider when it comes to processing. I didn't know what OEL was, or big squares were. I thought they were bales. But there's some real potential here for them. And so what those optimised OEL is optimised laminated timbers. And I don't know whether any of you have been through to the Scion Research place in Rotorua, and if you've been in the foyer there and into that building, it's made out of these laminated structures that are incredibly earthquake resilient and long lasting. And it could be a really good way for us to be building, or having our building industry work. One of the benefits of that sort of timber is that you can harvest it at 16 years. And so that could potentially change the whole dynamic of forestry in the area. And, you know, return on investment, you know, we talked about 12.5 being quite good. Well, return on investment there is 24% return on investment. So, you know, there's opportunities here that could exist locally if we can attract the right people and grasp it, okay? It's well outside my area of expertise. It's just what's been advised by the report writers as potential that we need to be considering. And of course there's employment benefits as well. There was 2 concurrent bits of work happening in terms of discussing and talking with farmers about farm attitudes to forestry and where they're wanting to go. And so this is just a summary of that really. The first point is really important that it's each scenario in planting trees on an individual farm is quite unique. Each farm has different goals and objectives, different strengths, different weaknesses, different access to resource, different capital base, all those sorts of things. And the discussion that you've got to have in talking with right tree, right place with a farmer is very intimate and personal, and it takes a long time. And so a broad brush approach doesn't work. One of the key things is that early in the conversation, you need to be working through whether it's a commercial outcome they want or if they're happy for having a non-commercial outcome. And, you know, that at that early stage, the species selection and what you do deviate quite substantially. And, you know, pine, if you've got a commercial intent, is really the default species, and it's very hard to get away from that when you compare it with other species. There's a desire by all the farmers that we spoke to grow the biodiversity around them. Every conversation you have with a farmer at the kitchen table, if there's a tui or a Te Uru that lands in the garden, the conversation stops and they talk about the biodiversity going on. And so there's a desire to do that. It's just how we can help them achieve that goal. So here's some farmer quotes and of the case studies we talked to and ran around. And so it's my interpretation and read with each of the, that's the next slide over. Righto. So the first quote was, if we put something in trees, we want it to fit with our morals and our values as farmers. So my point there, what I took out of that is farmer goals are deeper than just wealth creation. Our next quote was, it can cost a lot of money to run scenarios. Each species you add to that increases the cost. And so my take-home message there is that farmers understand issues around complexity. And they're running complex systems typically, and so adding a whole range of different tree species adds to that complexity, and they understand the cost of that. In the past we've tried poplars and we didn't have a good run with them. So farmers will be very tree specific or species specific, and they'll do their own research and understand what goes and works in their own community very well. Farming is known, forestry is not. Pines are simple and known. So that's just read understanding complexity issues as above, as I said before. Farmers also see themselves, and it wasn't a quote there, but it follows on from that. They see themselves as stockmen, typically. And so, and I mentioned in the report that we need to change subtly that view that they're land managers and they're more than stockmen. And so they get that in part, but when you dig down to, you dig into what they really love, it's actually working with their animals, it's working the horse, the dog, so adding a whole forestry component in there is not something they necessarily feel comfortable with. Next quote, Douglas fir was planted by my father. He liked to see a bit of variety. They may never be harvested. I don't know who quoted that actually, it might be the guy in the room. But the point is farmers are generational, and they don't just think about the next 10 or 15 years, they think about generations going on. I'm not keen on pines due to my thoughts around generational farming and the aesthetics as well, so I read all of the above. And the last key quote, sorry it didn't come up there because they're all worthwhile. If you have to search out a lot of info to get started, it would be good to get help with where to start. And I think this is a key issue, that there's a lack of good trusted help with the information that's out there. They need to be able to relate to somebody who's got mud on their boots and can spend time with them and debate detail, because it actually does come down to detail on each individual farm, which is the point I made in that first point. So to summarise that, it's the landowner's plan, and so if we go in there about a community aspiration of right tree, right place, that's cool, but it comes down to the individual. And you've got to really display, when you're sitting down at the kitchen table, it's about understanding and communicating the ethos of the right tree, right place. And so you can't go in there like I could charge in there like a bull at a gate and say, oh, we'll put it all into bloody pines because that's where you're going to get the best return. You know, you've got to take a step or two back and listen. And it's very much a relationship that's going to build up over time, and it's not a transactional one. I also think it's a team effort. I know my area of expertise, but in working through this, I absolutely know I need other people in there who understand other aspects of the chain as well. Right, so a bit of nitty-gritty here. This is for radiata. This is returns per hectare based on, as an annuity, based on carbon price. So bearing in mind, current price when we did the report was $35. Current price at the moment is $68, close enough to $70. The blue line represents the option you'd have if selected to harvest the pines. The green line is the option that you would take if you selected to leave it in permanent forest. Key point here is there's actually a crossover where based on carbon price, you're better off to have a harvest mentality. So every 28 years harvest the pines. But once the carbon price gets above about $43 a tonne, it switches. And so my point is at $68 a tonne, the carbon price not only threatens pastoral farming, but it threatens forestry as well, because we just get these big swathes of land that are going into trees that'll permanently stay there.
And for that forestry return, you'd still need to be thinning and pruning?
For the blue line, yes. For the green line, no.
Yeah, so it means that if you're asking a farmer to invest, at the moment, it doesn't make any sense, does it?
I'll come back to a little graph I've got further on, which shows the return that they get out of looking after their tree forest.
No, but what I mean is it kicks in earlier because you haven't got those outlays as well. Yeah. Well, so on what that graph's saying, Sally, is that less than $35 a tonne, because you're getting a $30,000 per hectare net stumpage. That's what we worked on, and I know some people might work on $35,000 a tonne. Even though that's 28 years out, there's an economic value in doing that for your business. Over $43 a tonne, just leave it. Quite sad.
That's only saying that you're not happy with $550 a hectare return, but it might not be the best option, but production is still a good option.
But that's true, Simon, for an individual making the decision. But what happens is land always, land sells, and in your case it might be a few generations on from where you are. But at some stage, your farm may be sold, And so if we take that across Te Uru and think about these, 85% of the land sales in 1919 went into forestry. It's pretty hard for anybody else who's looking to buy a farm in this area and not think about pines as use because of it. You can't compete against it.
What I'm saying is the production price is still one that's relatively what people want.
Yeah, but if say Lawrence here, he's trustee for a number of businesses, and he's sitting there wearing his trustee hat on, what's the best return for his beneficiaries? And he might say, and he's got a sound argument in saying, hey, the best return is to put it in permanent trees because that's where we're going to get the most money. You know, there's other arguments around why he may not do that, and I'm certain he's aware of that. In the right tree, right place principle, and working with farmers in their case studies, one of the key principles was as the quality of land increases, so not only do you get an increase in stocking rate, but you get a whole change in farm use as well. And so the EBIT that you get, you know, it starts climbing up. Okay, so that's just a core principle. It's obvious, but so it's not, you're not just running 8.8 stock units on class 6 country and 12 stock units on class 4 country. It's 12 stock units on class 4 country, but it's a different farming system, like you might be trading and finishing lambs or running bulls or whatever rather than breeding things. And so that principle is something that we used in our modelling.
So Robbie, with the poplar pots, you know, like,
Yep.
have you run the scenario if you have the poplars and the stock?
Absolutely, yeah.
As to how they compare with the production forestry?
Yep. And so that's the economics of putting in poles. So if you're putting in poles at 50 stems, I think it is, per hectare, then, you know, you've probably got an 90% pasture growth of what you had before, so you're getting your cake and you're eating it with your stock. You've got a bit of shelter and shade maybe, soil stability. So, but...
With the carbon from that,
And the carbon from that, at 50 poles per hectare, you should be able to claim carbon on that with the current loophole. That loophole will possibly close. So if we just put an overlay, and this graph is kind of complicated in a funny way, but I'll try to explain it. So the green line is the profitability in terms of per hectare on a stock unit basis as the stock units go up. So it's not just straight line increase in profitability because you change your farming system as your land class gets better. So that's the green line. The blue line is bringing in increase in land value that would happen over 2 harvest periods of a pine rotation. So, because what happens, typically we are getting an increase in land value, but when you put it into pines, you know, the bare land price of a pine tree is about, 60% or less, 40% of the pastoral land because it's been harvested and so when you bring in that land price, which is what we need to do, it's that blue line you look at. The grey line, and the principle here is that although forestry is sensitive to increasing land quality, it's not as sensitive as pastoral farming. And so that's why the gradient of the other 3 lines, the grey, the orange and the red, which represent forestry at various carbon levels, is relatively flat. So the grey line is just a commercial pine forest without carbon. And the sweet spot there where it crosses over is around about 6 stock units per hectare under the scenario here. When we bring in carbon at $35 a tonne, so what we did the modelling for, and use the orange line, you can see, or what the graph's trying to illustrate, is that the crossover point is around about that 12 to 30 stock units per hectare, where it's more economic to have it in pastoral, where you've got the land slightly better than 13 stock units a hectare. And when we bring in the price at $68 a tonne, it takes it up to 16 stock units per hectare. So what I did is I ran that through
one of the case studies to get a little bit more specific, because that previous graph was just sort of a generalised thing across a range of farms. Sorry.
Was that stock units per hectare wintered or stock units per hectare year round?
Good call. Year round. I was using FarmX to do that, which is an annualised stock unit. There is, yeah, but I think the traditional way of just using a winter stock unit doesn't really tell you the productivity of a farm. It underestimates the value of summer moist country, etc. So I prefer to use an annualised stocking rate rather than just the winter stocking rate. This example here is for one of the case studies. So they're carrying sort of around about just under 9 stock units per hectare currently. And if we look at the blue histograms, that is the break-even based on carbon price of between pastoral farming and forestry farming. Am I with you? So if we look at this $35 a tonne, okay, around about 6 stock units per hectare is the break-even between being in pastoral farming or being in forestry. The blue line, the green line is when you've selected to put that in permanent forestry. Now what happens, of course, I'm trying to illustrate, is when we get to this area here, that line there is, well over 12 stock units per hectare. And if I can, it doesn't like animations coming through. So in the animation, what I've done is put in land use classes around that as well, because that's what we're thinking. So in land use class, it's a pity that's not working because that was a key slide. Land use class, if you about 6 stock units per hectare, that's all that country in here that would be taken out is obviously class 7, class 6. In terms of class 4 country, which is what we're talking about for a lot of our country, it's all this land in here. Actually, it's probably better to show it in this next slide.
And that's not accounting for what could be in methane plus and livestock emissions.
I'll have another little slide on that. Sorry that animation's not working because it's actually a cool one, but I might be able to explain it a bit better with these next couple of slides. So this is just a geospatial layer of slope in the Te Uru Rakau, and if we overlay that this geospatial layer, the white line around the perimeter is Te Uru Rakau, and if we just had clicked on geospatial map class 1, 2 and 3, which is the sort of the coloured bits that you see there, that's our class 1, 2 and 3 land in this district. And so you hear from the politicians what we'll use as a now received class category, and so anything that's better than class 4 or 5 should go into forestry. Currently, at the pricing that we've got at $68 a tonne, it's more economic to have all that area that's not shaded in forestry. So that's a pretty daunting thing.
Have you got the percentage of the district land? What's that percentage?
Yeah, but not at the top of my head, but that's really easy for me to do. Just 5 minutes at the end of the presentation. Okay, so that's actually the next slide on, which I probably didn't format properly. what I've done then is I've just added in class 4 and 5, which is what the government neutered is what you're not in your head. Lawrence, you know what I'm talking about. To be honest, that means stuff all. All the rest of that land that's not shaded is class 6 or better, and so it would all go still into forestry if people were making rational decisions about land use. If we bring in class 6 country, then you can see the majority of our area in here is in that class 6 category. Those little shaded areas that are left is class 7 and 8. So clearly, you know. The other point around this is when I was working with the case study farm, we broke that class land 6 down into various subclasses. And that had to be done on a to use for this sort of data. It actually comes down to a paddock by paddock assessment of what should go where. So what I'm suggesting is if we hear politically it comes out that we should be putting land class 6 and better into forestry, it's disastrous for Te Uru. If they break that down into land use classes of class 6 down into its further subclasses, there's not the resolution to do that accurately. You with me?
A lot of farms, as I said, the 70% of full country farmers have already got those maps with far more detail than.
Yes, because of the work that the Horizons Regional Council have done. Absolutely. But it is a farm by farm, paddock by paddock job, and it takes a specialist to do it.
So that's what's in the slurry plan.
That's what's in some of the slurry plans, yes. And the case study I used had a really good slurry plan that was excellent, that had that broken down. It needed some further work. I can explain that later really, but it wasn't quite there. This graph here just summarises the segmentation of carbon versus the other species, and it just says why, of the various species, and the top blue line is radiata, and that's why radiata is always where we go to.
So what was the red?
That's hardwoods, and so it has quite a good starting point.
What are you talking, poplars?
It could do poplars, but it's like some eucalypts as well. But when you do the NPV on it, Tony, under current, see that's the problem. Because as the carbon price goes up, it just pushes pine more and more and more, you know? And at $65 a tonne or $68 a tonne, you get an NPV of 11 or 12 or 15 out of hardwoods and 30 out of pines. And so people making rational investment decisions don't put hardwoods in. Somebody asked a question about greenhouse gas, at the back there. Again, I'm a bit doom and gloom at the moment, but I don't end up in that spot, okay? So, because I think we've got some opportunities. But this is another bit of a doom and gloom, really, but it sets the scene and we need to understand what's ahead of us. So, for 151 hectare dairy farm, this was done by a colleague of mine in Waikato, and that must be the average size of a dairy farm up there or something. And in order to offset their greenhouse gas emissions at 5%, they need sort of 3.3 hectares, and as it goes up to 100% of greenhouse gas emissions, they need to offset 100 hectares. Doesn't take long to run out of farmers. And for a 640 hectare sheep and beef farm, you know, it starts taking out hunks of land there as well. So what a rational dairy farmer would do is not put his land into trees. He'd come down here, buy cheaper land and put that into trees.
He's already doing it.
So that's the pressure. And that's not going away under the current situation that we find ourselves in. Okay? So we did 3 in-depth case studies where we farm-axed them and modelled what was going on. For one of those case studies, they were committed to an afforestation program, and so we just gleaned the information about why they were doing it, what sort of returns they were getting out of it. For the other 2, we did a little bit more detailed geospatial mapping, where they would likely put trees and what the benefits would come out of that. So this is case study 1. From memory, it comes up later, 720 hectares. It was one of Grant's sloughing properties. There was some really detailed and good work done. It was actually one of the better farm environment plans I'd seen. Good analysis of the land classes in there, broken down into, you can see in the legend there, I don't know, 10 or 15, 10 land use classes, done paddock by paddock. What I did then was using the FarmX analysis. The farm had been on FarmX for a number of years, so we had good historical information. I was able to attribute the actual amount of grass that was grown in each of those LUC classifications. These, as Tony would know, these broad descriptions for each LUC in terms of what it actually theoretically would grow. But you
that was actually what's in every footy plan.
Yep.
So
But
that's what we all have.
yep, but that's good. But this one was good. This one was they'd spent a little bit of time on it. I'm not saying I haven't seen them all, but this was.
Have you seen the bad?
I've seen some holes in some. Whether that's bad or not, I don't know. It depends on what your level is. But I like this one. I'm not trying to, I don't want to go there. The point is, the current land use classification system, there is no correlation that's scientifically worked through that LUC class 6E7 in this environment grows that much. And there's just, there's a range in which it might grow. And it would be a great project to actually put some quantifiable data around what it actually does. And if we're going to go down the LUC thing for forestry, that's what needs to be done. Anyway, so we're able to do that on this particular property. And we ran, after quite a few scenarios we ran, these 2 broad scenarios that we reported on. So scenario 1 is that blue area, and it incorporates some land that's already unproductive. Scenario 2 just takes in a further land class that was next lowest performing in terms of the ranking of pasture production. So I got that wrong. It was 791 hectares, sorry, of grazed area. In scenario 1, my apologies, in scenario 1 we took out 130 hectares of that land. It changed the stocking rate down from 7,134 stock units to 6,510 annualised stock units. And that was all, we modelled that on farm access to what the likely scenario would be in terms of the policies that they would run. And so that was a slight decrease in the number of cows running, a slight increase in new weights, etc. In terms of, so there was a slight increase in performance. And the stock units removed of that 130 hectares averaged 4.8 stock units per hectare. In the next scenario, we took out a further land class 6E7, which is slightly better
than the 6E3, 3E rather. And the stocking rate on that extra 85 hectares was 6.5 hectares, 6.5 stock units per hectare. So what does that mean? And you can't read that bugger. Okay, so you're going to have to believe me when I talk about some of these numbers. In terms of EBIT, for the base, there was an EBIT there of about $130,000. So an EBIT is before interest. It was wages of management was put in there. Some of the current wages that we're paying were taken out. I used, for the sake of keeping this place slightly confidential, I used the beef and lamb costings per hectare rather than their own individual ones. And so I used the core data, but I changed some of the numbers. And in terms of fertiliser, I ran an overseer model and determined what would be maintenance for the current stock units at our county. So it's not necessarily exactly what was happening in this case study. When in scenario 1, when we took out that 130 hectares, the gross, the EBIT lifted up to $150,000. And so what that's telling us is that that poor 130 hectares had a negative contribution to the farm. And that was because of maintenance costs, fertiliser costs, you know, just taking that land out, having less cows, all those sorts of things. So putting that 130 hectares into another land use that gave a positive result, regardless of how positive it was, would place the farm in a better position. In the scenario that we worked in, we put that into pines. And the net result was an EBIT of $186,000 over annualised income. So a substantial difference, and a decrease in greenhouse gas by greenhouse gas decrease. I can't see that there. Yeah, greenhouse gas by a 9% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions across the farm, and a 5% decrease in nitrogen loss across that farm. So my advice to that farmer would be, let's really pursue down this pathway, because it's a bit of a no-brainer. You know, you have less greenhouse gas, less nitrogen going out, less sediment, and greater EBIT. When we took out that next class of land, which is that land class, still land class 6, but slightly better, we got a fundamentally different result. And that is, that land, which was on average carrying 6.5 stock units, was positively contributing to the bottom line. And so it actually cost $20,000 taking out that next 85 hectares of land. So my advice to the farmer would be, hey, we won't go there under the current scenario if we were looking at long-term pasture production. When you add in carbon on top of that, at $35 a tonne, it brought it back to the base level. So you're ambivalent at $35 a tonne as to what you do. At $68 a tonne, it becomes a no-brainer. You bloody sell a lot and move to taupo.
So the whole farm goes on through the dip?
No, not quite. I shouldn't have said that. All that land class 6 is vulnerable at $68 a tonne. He had the family have got some beautiful class 3 country, but the problem is it probably takes it down to an uneconomic scale. And I haven't seen these pine trees stopping at class 3 country. I've seen them planting through sheep yards and cattle yards. In terms of, for them, the carbon sequestration that happens, and because in the scenario I elected for a harvest thing and for 2 rotations, you can see the carbon accumulation, it all happens pretty early on in the piece. Somebody asked a question about return. This graph here, it's not particularly great in terms of clarity for you, but this is the return in establishing that pine forest, number of years based by carbon price. So at $35 a tonne, the whole forestation is paid for out of carbon after 12 years, which I think has been one of the real slow points or hesitant points in people putting some of that worst country into trees. It's just cash flowing it. I mean, what carbon does is give us this wonderful opportunity to actually cash flow it and get it done. At the higher rates here, which we are now, payback is 6-7 years. And that's for this particular farmer, that's his income flow. So the orange histograms are just the income that they receive. So there's obviously a negative in the first year, and then a bit of carbon revenue, and then 2 harvest cycles. I threw in there a couple of other little bits and pieces. There was some eucalypts I chucked in the corner as well, and that's why there's other blips in there. And the blue line is the accumulated revenues from that forested.